Last I left you, we had just discussed the assassination of President Jack Kennedy. And, we were looking at his assassination in the context of the Vietnam conflict. So obviously his assassination has implications that go well beyond just the Vietnam War. Okay, so but we're looking at it in just this context. So when he was assassinated, President Lyndon B. Johnson takes over, and he also a Democrat. He also wants to ensure that he wants to be seen as not soft on communism, as that is the big concern for America and fulfilling its policy of containment. So he's overly aggressive in his decision making in the escalation of the American involvement in Indochina and in Vietnam. All right, so we mentioned yesterday that there was an alleged event that took place in this place called the Gulf of Tonkin, where an American destroyer called the USS Maddox was patrolling in the Gulf of Tonkin, and it was it was a rough seas, bad weather, couldn't really see, and the crew reported that enemy torpedoes were being fired at it, and so the destroyer USS Maddox and the other ships around it began firing. But once all the dust settled, the crew of the Maddox declared that they had never seen nor heard any enemy gunfire. But this alleged attack prompted President Johnson to begin a bombing campaign and strikes against the North Vietnamese. So he asked Congress for sweeping powers, all powers that would be necessary for him to mount an armed attack against these communist aggressors. And Congress obliges him and adopts the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, which is not a formal declaration of war, but it does give President Johnson major power to use the military as he sees fit. So he rolls out with Operation Rolling Thunder, which is a sustained bombing of North Vietnam, and begins to send a massive amount of American troops to Vietnam, numbering about 50,000 by June of 1965. So the Vietnam and the Vietnam conflict, the Vietnam War, becomes fully Americanized, and it is America and versus the communist forces of the North Vietnamese. Okay? So that's pretty much where we left off yesterday, right? Okay, so much of the nation supported Lyndon Johnson's determination to contain communism in Vietnam in the years following 1965. Okay, early in the conflict, most Americans were like, yeah, this needs to be done. So President Johnson began sending large numbers of American troops to fight alongside the South Vietnamese that had been trained by Americans under the Kennedy administration. And even after Congress had approved the Tonkin Resolution, President Johnson really wasn't all in favor of sending that many troops. But there was a presidential election that took place in 1964. It was an election year. He had only been president for less than a year because Kennedy was assassinated in November of 63. So Johnson's victory in the 1964 presidential election was due in part not so much of his own will, of his own character, but because of his opponent. His opponent was a guy named Barry Goldwater. Barry Goldwater was a Republican and staunch anti-communist who was so anti-communist, a lot of Americans were afraid that he might push us into not just war in Vietnam, but war with who? Who's our big communist threat? The Soviet Union. So many Americans were weary and fearful of that. So In contrast to Goldwater's heated, warlike language, President Johnson's speeches were more moderate. Yet he did speak of containing communism where it already existed. In one of their debates, President Johnson says things like, he's not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. And that's an actual quote from Lyndon Baines Johnson. However, once he wins the election, that's precisely what he does. Okay? Working closely with his foreign advisors, Robert McNamara and Dean Rusk. Robert McNamara was the Secretary of Defense. He's on the left. And Dean Rusk was the American Secretary of State. Both of these are the president's advisors. President Johnson began dispatching tens of thousands of American soldiers to Vietnam. Many Americans resented this. Why? Why would Americans be upset about it? Is he kind of going against what he promised in his campaign a little bit? It's not the first time a politician's gone back on a campaign promise, and I guarantee you it will not be the last. So, many Americans viewed Johnson's decision as contradictory to his position during the presidential campaign. But a lot of people still saw this policy of confronting communism and containing it anywhere in the world as necessary. So Congress, as well as the American public, strongly supported Johnson's strategy early in '65. In fact, a poll conducted in March of 1965 showed that 61% of Americans supported American involvement in Vietnam, while only 24% opposed. 61% in favor. Boy, that changes really quick. It changes really quick. But initially, people were in favor. Now, obviously, there's going to be some dissenters, too. But for the most part, early on, it was supported. Okay, so we're at war. It's never declared, but we are at war. So by the end of 1965, we've got 180,000 American troops in Vietnam. 180,000, okay? American soldiers on the ground in Vietnam. The commander of those troops was a man by the name of General William Westmoreland. Look at that chin. Look at that jaw. Doesn't he just look like he was made in a factory to be a general? He does. Well, that's the commanding officer of all the American forces in South Vietnam, General William Westmoreland. And Westmoreland, even though he had 180,000 troops at his disposal, continued to request even more. Westmoreland was a West Point graduate who was a World War II veteran. He was a Korean War veteran and was not particularly impressed with the fighting ability of his allies, which would be the South Vietnamese Army, also known as ARVN. ARVN. These are the troops that Americans had trained. The Army of the Republic of Vietnam. ARVN. Army of the Republic of Vietnam. The ARVN, according to General Westmoreland, could not stand up to the pressure without substantial American assistance. So they were not good soldiers. That's basically what he said. So he believed that the only way that our policy of containment could be effective is by sending more United States soldiers. And throughout the early years of Vietnam, President Johnson complies and continues to send even more and more and more. And by 1967, 500,000 Americans were in Vietnam. 500,000 Americans. An army of 500,000 troops deployed to a foreign country. It's getting to the point where almost every American family is impacted by this conflict in some way. So, when the United States first entered this conflict, this war in Vietnam, the United States believed that American dedication, American hard work, and American superior weaponry would lead it to victory over the forces of communism known as the Viet Cong. However, the terrain of Vietnam proved to be extremely difficult. What's it like? What's the geography of it?
Jungle.
It's a jungle, okay? The jungle terrain, the way in which Ho Chi Minh had trained his VC or Viet Cong troops to fight in guerrilla warfare tactics, very soon turned the war into a brutal, frustrating stalemate. The enemy of the Viet Cong were extremely elusive. Even though they lacked high-powered weaponry of like the Americans, they used hit and run and ambush tactics. They were never going to openly engage the Americans on like an open field. They would hide in trees, set up traps, ambushes, and combine that with their keen knowledge of the jungle terrain, add that to their advantage, moving secretly and quietly in and out of the general population of the American troops and the general population of the Vietnamese people. You don't know, because they're not wearing uniforms. They could just be dressed like a guy. And if you're in Saigon, the enemy could be right there. So the Viet Cong destroyed the notion of a traditional fight. It's not like, okay, our side is over here, we got blue uniforms, and your side's over there, you got green. Okay, we know who's who. We're going to meet at this time on the battlefield. And we're going to have a fight. That's not how the VC fought. Okay, they totally destroyed the notion of traditional, frontline attacking. So it was very difficult for American troops to be able to discern friend from foe. It's not like they're wearing uniforms. So, a woman in a Vietnamese village or town might be selling soft drinks to American soldiers. They could be a Viet Cong spy. She could be a communist woman. Or a boy standing on a street corner selling newspapers may be having a grenade in his other hand, getting ready to throw it into a crowd of American soldiers. Pretty scary. So not only that, but another way they were extremely elusive was the network of elaborate tunnels that they built, which would allow them to withstand airstrikes. I mean, if you're a dozen feet underground and a bomb goes off overhead, okay, no harm done. You're in a tunnel. So they allowed them to withstand airstrikes, and then they could pop out of the ground with silence and attack, launch a surprise attack, and then quickly disappear, and Americans would never even know that they were there. This is an extremely elaborate tunnel system. We're not talking like just a couple holes in the ground where people could hide. We're talking tunnels that would connect villages together so that they would never even have to do any movement above ground. And they could move unbeknownst to any American troops. So, connecting villages through the countryside, the tunnels became home to many guerrilla Viet Cong fighters. So, they feel like they're fighting for their land, and the more Americans tried to drive them away from their land, the more they dug and burrowed in. So the tunnels were used to a great advantage for VC guerrilla fighters. In addition, the jungle terrain is laced with countless booby traps, landmines, and because the exact location of the Viet Cong forces was unknown, United States troops often laid their own landmines throughout the jungle, and could also, cause harm to their own troops. So, the Viet Cong laid their own traps. The United States troops disassembled, reused their own mines. American soldiers marching through South Vietnam jungles only dealt with some of the worst conditions of warfare. Because it is a jungle. What's the weather like? Hot. Sweltering hot. Okay? And then, not to mention, it has a monsoon season where it would rain for months at a time. Not like oh, it's raining. I can't wait for the sun to come out. It would rain and rain and rain and not stop raining for months. Okay? It's called the monsoon. So American soldiers marching through the jungles and the rice paddies not only dealt with sweltering heat and leeches. You guys know leech, like insect, the leeches, blood-sucking leeches. But they also had to be cautious of every step because the next step could be one that blows their legs off or kills them. Very, very dangerous, frustrating. So how do you win? How are we going? You're General Westmoreland. You just got a chin implant. How do you defeat them? What would you do? Come on, think like a soldier. How are you going to win? How do you defeat an army that fights like this?
Bombs.
Okay, bombs.
Fire.
And they are bombing. They are using napalm. Lots of napalm. Lots of fire. They do that. Constant bombardment from airplanes. Safer. You know, they don't have the technology to blow our airplanes up out of the sky. They might get lucky and hit one with some bullets, but not like they have the Javelin missile that locks on and heat-seeking. They don't have that. So, okay, but what could they do to counter the bombing and counter the napalm? Yeah, go underground. So is that really that effective? No, not really. It can be if you can catch them out in the open, but that's kind of the trick. Catch them in the open. All right, so what else could you do? How else can you make, how else are we going to win?
Make your own tunnels.
Okay.
Like fight like the enemy.
Fight like the enemy? Some problems with that? They know the terrain a little better than we do, and they've already got the good spots. All right, we could go, try to seek out into their tunnels, but they have their tunnels booby-trapped. Yeah.
Go through the villages and stuff.
Okay, go to the villages. What are you going to do there?
I don't know. Ask if they know where they are.
They're not gonna tell you. It's gonna be a spy, you ask.
They're gonna probably try to bomb you or throw a grenade at
Yeah,
you.
that's why you hold them hostage.
Okay. Okay.
Hostages always work.
Well, General Westmoreland's plan is to just hang in there and kill as many as possible. He's going to destroy the Viet Cong morale through a war of attrition. He's a veteran of World War II. He's a West Point graduate. He studied the tactics of World War I. How were those wars won? Attrition. He believes that the gradual wearing down of the enemy through continuous harassment will lead to their morale being devastated and their ultimate defeat.
So you just lighten them up and just
Constant hurt. You engage them anywhere and everywhere that you can. If you can go into battle, you go into battle. He also introduces, but how do you report that and say to the people at home, we are winning? How do you determine if you're winning? Because you're not like, okay, we need to take this battle, we need this strategic piece of land so that we can have control, so we can launch. That's not the purpose here. We're not trying to capture land. We're not trying to do that. We're trying to kill people. So what do you do to report? What do you report on to let the people at home know things are going well?
how many people you killed.
Body count. Body count. So he introduces the concept of the body count, or tracking the number of Viet Cong killed in battle. The general believed that as the number of Viet Cong dead rose, the guerrilla fighting would inevitably surrender. I guess it's a decent theory. We have 500,000 troops over there. And he says we're just going to kill them with our superior war machines until they quit.
Are they just killing
when you drop napalm from a plane, it doesn't go around the hospital.
So they were just killing whoever possible.
I don't want to say that they were like actively targeting, but if you're engaging the enemy anywhere and everywhere, are there going to be civilian deaths?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there were. I'm not saying that our American troops were like singling out and targeting children. That's not. But were there children that were attacking American troops?
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, I don't know what I would do in that situation. It's tough. This was like a tough. And
If they were attacking me, I'd be like,
I know. You'd have to defend yourself and fight.
You have to defend yourself. That's pretty
I know, and then
though. Hit me.
And it's so bad for our veterans too, guys. Our veterans really suffered in this war because as the war goes on, because it's a war of attrition, and that's the way we have to fight. And people who begin to oppose the war, they begin to report things like the bad stuff, like these Vietnamese children are being killed, and so our veterans are coming. Like some of our veterans are coming home, and there's like people protesting, like calling them baby killers. And these are people that have like been living in a jungle, in a sweltering jungle covered in leeches, not knowing if their next step is going to be their last, fighting for their country, and then they come home and the people are like, boo.
Yeah, that's
Super sad for these guys. So, needless to say, the Viet Cong, regardless of America's tactics, have no intention of quitting their fight. Despite the growing number of casualties and the relentless pounding from American bombers, the Viet Cong, who were receiving supplies from places like China, from places like the Soviet Union, remained defiant. And even Defense Secretary McNamara confessed in his frustration to a reporter in 1966 that if I had thought that they would take this punishment and fight this well, I would have thought totally different about getting involved from the start. So pretty quickly becomes unpopular because we are stacking up the bodies. The body count for the Viet Cong is way higher than the body count for Americans. It really was. But what's the purpose? The purpose seems to get lost, okay? So General Westmoreland would later say that the United States never lost a battle in Vietnam. Whether the general's words are true or not is really underscored by the fact that America is misunderstood by its foe. The United States viewed this as a strictly military struggle, here to stop communism. The Viet Cong saw it as a struggle for their very existence. Put yourself in the shoes of the communist people. What was America's strategy? And what was General Westmoreland's way to do that? Killing them. Just seeking them out and killing them through whatever any means necessary. You think that's going to create some pretty hardened hearts? Big time. So the Viet Cong saw it as a battle for their very existence, and they were ready to pay any price for victory. All right. Okay, so I think that's a pretty good place to stop because we'll talk about the battle for hearts and minds next time.